Okay, good morning. See a lot of familiar faces out there, a number of my colleagues from Basin and DGC. I'm not sure exactly what it means when the intro music is "Take This Job and Shove It." So maybe one of them arranged for that to be played as I was coming up here. So it's wonderful to be here. I am Todd Brickhouse. I'm Basin's interim CEO. Joined Basin in June of 2022, and then became its interim CEO in July of this year. So since I've been here, I've probably done 30 or 35 of these type discussions, and inevitably after it, someone comes up to me and says, "It doesn't sound like you're from North Dakota." So yes, I guess the accent does give it away. I am from Virginia originally. And then after that question, it's, well, why did you move to North Dakota? And of course, it's a host of personal and professional reasons. First among those is that Basin is an outstanding organization. But my wife has come up with a somewhat more humorous answer. She tells people that when we hit 50 years old and we each had our midlife crises, we didn't buy expensive sports cars, we didn't cheat on each other, and we didn't get divorced. We moved to North Dakota. So I'm glad she chose number 4, I'll say that. So what I was going to review today is just give a Basin Electric overview for those of you that aren't familiar with Basin, talk briefly about our sustainability report and how that ties into some other things that are going on with the regulatory overreach that we see, especially out of Washington. Take a look at Basin Electric's assets, focusing on our coal assets, and then talk briefly about carbon sequestration. So let me just see a show of hands. How many of you get your power from an electric cooperative? Okay, so quite a few. So hopefully I don't bore you getting into these specifics. Does anyone have any idea how many electric cooperatives there are in the United States? Any guesses? Okay, I've got that answer for you. There are 832 distribution cooperatives in the United States. And then there are 63 generation and transmission cooperatives in the United States. So the scale of the cooperative network is extensive. Distribution cooperatives have 2.7 million miles of distribution line. That is 47 or 42% of the distribution lines that are strung in the United States. However, those distribution cooperatives only serve about 13% in terms of the number of consumers and the load for electricity in the United States. So distribution cooperatives are primarily in more rural areas of the country, so you have less density per mile of line. And then, again, I started my career, if you look over there in Virginia, where the L and the D are in old, that's about where I lived. And so we served Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. Like Basin, we were a FERC-regulated utility. Just a few Basin statistics here. I won't go through all of these, but we are a not-for-profit utility, and I emphasize not-for-profit. That doesn't mean we are nonprofit. We actually target a profit margin every year of $150 million or thereabout, and that's so we can invest for growth and do the maintenance CapEx that we need to maintain a reliable system. Basin has an all-of-the-above energy strategy, which I know, looking at the agenda, you're going to hear about that tomorrow as well from, refreshingly, a gentleman from the state of California. We have 2,500 miles of transmission lines. We have 6 subsidiaries. I'm not going to talk about all of those. I'll just talk about Dakota Gasification, which is our largest subsidiary. We have $2.8 billion in revenue, a balance sheet of $8.4 billion, and then we maintain credit ratings with 3 credit rating agencies. That's our primary means of raising capital, is through the bond market, so we want to have strong credit ratings. A picture of Basin's service territory. We serve 9 states. We have 141 members. So we have about 1/12 of all the cooperatives in the country are members of Basin Electric. We serve 3 million consumers across our 9-state territory, and our service territory is 500,000 square miles. To put that in context for you, that's about 13% of the square miles in the United States. We serve a lot of North Dakota. Central Power, Upper Missouri, and then District 9 are 2 unaffiliated distribution cooperatives that are members of Basin. The gray area on the east side of the map is served by another cooperative, Minn Kota. And then you have a number of investor-owned utilities that serve the more urban areas of the state, like Bismarck, as well as Fargo, Williston, and other urban areas. And so we are, Basin is what I describe as a 3-tiered electric utility. You have the distribution cooperative that would serve the ultimate consumer, be the last mile of line to our houses. For example, if you live around Bismarck, you might be served by Capital Electric Cooperative. Capital Electric Cooperative is a distribution cooperative. Capital, in turn, is a member of Central Power Electric Cooperative. And then Central Power is, being the 2nd tier, is a member of the 3rd tier, which is Basin Electric. So that might be more details about cooperatives that you want to know, but that's how, if you're a member of one of Basin's members, how the utility is structured. And Basin's unique in the country in that most generation and transmission cooperatives and distribution cooperatives are just in a 2-tiered system, where you've got generation and then you've got distribution. So Basin's a little different. Associated out in Missouri is also a 3-tiered system. So just 2 cooperatives in the country that are 3-tiered systems. If you look at Basin across the broader utility industry and you include investor-owned utilities, depending on how you measure it, we are the 19th or 20th largest utility in the United States. And this gives you a sense of the scale of our service territory and the scale of our asset base. We've got 4 coal plants with 8 units spread amongst those plants, 2 in North Dakota, which I'll touch on a little bit later, and then 2 in Wyoming. We've got 6 gas plants, and we have a lot of wind and some solar scattered across the Great Plains and the upper Midwest. So when I look at Basin on a map, I'm always captivated by the scale of our service territory, and I think these statistics drive that home. The states that we serve produce a dominant amount of any number of commodities that we use in our daily lives. And so I look at Basin on a map, and then I look at these statistics, and I can proudly say that Basin Electric's assets are the engines of commerce for a service territory that feeds and fuels our nation. So you'll see here how our generation mix has changed over the last 22 years and how we expect that it's going to change over the next 6 years. Going back to 2000, we were almost entirely coal. 85% of our generation was coal. By last year, coal was under 40% of our generation mix. That trend has been driven by a number of factors. First, the decrease in coal, some of that is the regulatory overreach that is practiced by the EPA relative to coal assets. Although Basin did build one of the more recent coal facilities, Dry Fork Station in Wyoming, that came online in 2012. Second reason for the change in the mix is what's going on in North Dakota, the Bakken oil field. A lot of natural gas has been produced there, a lot of economic natural gas, so we've capitalized on that. Similar to our strategy of using coal historically, we're using local resources and turning them into higher productive use. And then third, there have been improving economics of wind and solar resources. Some of that is technology advancements. I'll be the first to admit that a good part of that is government subsidies, but we are blessed in North Dakota and in South Dakota and across the Great Plains to have the wind blowing quite regularly. So that helps us add renewable resources into the mix. So if you talk to any utility leader in this room, or probably any energy leader across the country, they're going to tell you that we have been in a carbon-constrained environment for the past 15 or 20 years. However, I'll speak for Basin, we've done our part. The carbon intensity of each megawatt hour that we sell to our members has decreased by over 30% since 2005. A number of our stakeholders, most prominently the EPA, tell us that this isn't enough. And then somewhat more frustratingly, a number of our financial and insurance stakeholders say it's not enough. And so what they have begun doing is evaluating us through an environmental, social, and governance framework. You might have heard the acronym ESG. And ESG, I'll tell you from my experience, is really capital E, lowercase s, and lowercase g. And the capital E, I don't mean to take you around the alphabet, but the capital E is really a capital C. And that capital C is carbon. Again, we're in a carbon-constrained environment. I'll tell you that I think ESG stands for something else. Energy stops growing. That's the way that, unfortunately, a lot of people, a lot of regulators in particular, would like us to practice it. It's a problem for a modern economy. If energy stops growing, our standard of living is undoubtedly going to decrease. So I think and I hope that the ESG hysteria in this country reached its peak in mid-2022. I'll tell a story. Shortly before I got to Basin Electric, we were trying to do a bond offering to fund our capital expenditure program. That was in April of 2022. And the bond market was a little bit on edge at that time, and I'd say the capital markets more broadly were as well, because that was the time that people had figured out that the Federal Reserve was serious about raising interest rates in order to stave off more inflation. So people were looking for a reason not to invest. And they also were able to attach themselves to this ESG mantra. And they wanted to know, what is Basin doing to minimize its carbon footprint? And they wanted to look at everything through the ESG framework. So my first assignment as Basin's chief financial officer was to address this. And it was a fantastic project because we assembled a team with really experienced people, a number of whom are here today, and it let me meet and work with a broad cross-section of the organization on a very substantive issue, Basin's carbon footprint. Just like any other utility has a carbon footprint, Basin probably, among G&Ts, generation and transmission cooperatives, has the largest coal fleet. So it's a significant issue for us. But again, a great project to learn the organization and to tackle a serious challenge for Basin going forward. So what did we do with our sustainability report? And I emphasize this is a sustainability report. It is not an environmental, social, and governance report. We wanted to focus on sustainability. So the first thing we did is we focused on reliability, which you've heard a lot about today, and you're going to hear more throughout the course of this meeting, and we focused on affordability. What we did not do is to commit to carbon reductions that current technology cannot provide for. And if you talk to utility executives that have made the commitments, a lot of them to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, what they'll tell you is they know how to get to about 80% there. And it's going to cost more to get there, and it's probably going to cost some with respect to reliability too. They don't know how to get to that last 20%. Basin, we pride ourselves on integrity. We're not going to commit to something that we don't have a clear way of getting to with what technology currently allows. And our sustainability report allowed us to tell our story. We have we've been proud leaders in environmental stewardship since our founding. We are leaders in carbon sequestration, which I'll touch on in a few minutes. We put a primary focus on safety, and we put our people and our communities first. And then our governance story is actually exceptional. We're cooperative. Our entire board is democratically elected at each of the 3 levels of our organization. So after all this, the EPA obviously is still not satisfied. And so this is what we call our train wreck slide. And Mike Nazzi has a version of this that he shares frequently, and he can certainly talk about this more eloquently than I can and talk about the finer points of the legal issues here. But this is a timeline of all the environmental regulations that the EPA is targeting at our coal and natural gas assets. So we're going to have to fight this in court. And I'll tell you, the Lignite Energy Council does a great job representing you in coordinating these issues. I've been going to the meetings for just 3 months. We've probably had a handful of meetings, and our efforts are focused on pushing back against this regulatory overreach from the EPA. So I think when we look at this as utility executives, we're somewhat incredulous because the EPA thinks that we can make this conversion from carbon-based and some nuclear generation in the United States to renewable generation. And a number of Americans think that as well. And we find ourselves asking, us individually, to ourselves and to each other, why is this? And I've got a couple of theories on that I'll share with you. One, we've never failed the United States electric consumer. When each of us goes to put our finger on that light switch in the morning or at night, that light switch comes on over 99% of the time. We've made it too easy for people. People flip the switch and they think that's how electricity is made. They don't understand the difficulty and the hard work behind that. My second theory on why this is the case and why people think we can do this is a little bit broader and farther afield, and some people might say, well, these are crackpot theories. But I say that it's also related to the fact that we've lost a practical sense of how food gets on the table and how goods get delivered to us. And on the food part, just over 100 years ago, it was between 1910 and 1920, you had more people in the United States living in urban areas than you did in rural areas. And I'll just reflect on my own family. And it's going to be a little bit different than what you all experience in North Dakota because, again, my family, I grew up in Virginia, and my family's from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. But I am the second generation in my family not to be born on a farm. So what does that mean? That means when my parents were kids and teenagers, when it was time for Thanksgiving or time for Christmas or over the summer break, they went to their grandparents to the farm. They were back on the farm. They saw how crops were grown. They saw, how livestock was raised, et cetera. And thankfully, I was able to experience that as well. Not as frequently as my parents, but my grandparents were still alive and the farms were still owned in the family. So I'd go back to the farm probably 2 or 3 times a year. Now, if you look at my kids, the third generation of my family not to be born on a farm, well, they haven't had that experience. The farm has changed hands. And I think this is difficult for people in North Dakota to understand because we're so much more of a rural and agricultural economy. And a number of the people that I work with at Basin, they are the first people to work outside the farm in their professional lives. And then the second statistic that I'll throw at you is that you go back to 1950, and about 50% of the jobs in this country were manufacturing based. You look to today, 2022, that statistic it's under 10%. It's really more like, I think it's 8 or 9% of the jobs in this country are manufacturing based. So we've lost a practical sense of how food is put on the table and how goods and services or really goods are delivered. People pick up their phone, they go on their Amazon app, and the good shows up at their house within a couple of days. So again, maybe this is just my crackpot theory, but I think you've had just kind of the evolution away from rural and an agricultural-based economy and away from a manufacturing economy. We've lost some of the practical sense of actually how hard work is done and how things are produced. So people still want us to transition from a carbon and some nuclear-based generation fleet in this country to a renewable fleet. Let's look at how that is playing out in real time. So SPP, Southwest Power Pool, is a regional transmission organization. It's a power market, and it stretches from the Canadian border, North Dakota is in SPP, all the way down to New Mexico and north of Texas. So it's a big power pool, and I'll touch on MISO in a minute, which is to our east, and similarly runs up the Midwest down to the Gulf Coast. So SPP had a new peak load this summer of just over 56,000 megawatts. Of that peak load, to serve that peak load, you'll look here and you'll see that coal and gas made up over 41,000 of those megawatts. That is 74% of the peak load, served by carbon-based resources. What did the renewable fleet do? Well, you had solar pitching in 149 megawatts, and you had wind pitching in 8,300 megawatts. So together, they were about 15% of the generation mix when SPP hit its peak. MISO is just over twice the size of SPP. You see similar statistics here. Coal and gas were 75% at the summer peak of 122,000 megawatts. They contribute about 92,000 megawatts. And you look at solar and wind, they did much worse during the MISO peak. They were under 5% of the energy produced at the time of the peak. I won't spend a lot of time here, but what this looks at is SPP, how their generation mix has changed from dispatchable resources like natural gas and coal to renewable resources, and then the same in MISO. The difference here, SPP has been able to do a more rapid and larger switch because the wind blows a little bit more in our regions. So what has this meant for reliability? The chart on the left just shows how SPP has progressed in time in adding non-dispatchable resources, renewable resources to their generation mix. The chart on the right is alerts and advisories, and what that means is that load is increasing and they're getting worried about having enough generation to provide for that load. Well, from 2010 to 2018, there were no advisories or alerts. You get to 2019, you had 12 of them. COVID years, those dipped down, and then they have continued to skyrocket in 2021 and 2022. The electric system is getting less reliable and more fragile. So why is fuel diversity important? Well, this slide and the next slide look at the wind capacity in SPP. As of this spring, SPP had 32,000 megawatts of wind capacity. That's nameplate. However, if you look at how much wind has actually been delivered into the system at one time, SPP set a record in the spring. That was 24,000 megawatts of capacity delivered into the system. So 75% of what the actual nameplate should be. So let me switch to the next slide, and this just blows up the orange line that was on the previous slide. So on June 5th of this year, just before 5 p.m., wind was at 5,400 megawatts in SPP. So that's 17% of wind's nameplate, 32,000 megawatts of capacity. If you go 15 hours later, the next morning on June 6th, you had 110 megawatts of wind. That is less than 1% of the nameplate capacity. Then you go to the next day, wind had started blowing again. You had 7,900 megawatts of wind capacity online. So 25% of the available capacity in SPP. You need to have dispatchable resources to back this up. Answer is nuclear and coal, because we're going to have real problems when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. 250 people died in Texas in 2021 during Winter Storm Uri because of statistics like this. And can you only imagine what would happen in North Dakota, where Texas, I think it was below zero for 4 days. We can have 4 weeks below zero here. It's truly frightening. So the Western world has made a trade over the past 20 years. We have exported our manufacturing base to China, maybe some other countries in there too in the Far East, and we've also exported our emissions. In 2000, China had $253 billion of exports. That number was $3.5 trillion in 2022. China's emissions have gone from 3.6 billion tons of carbon in 2000 to almost 12 billion tons of carbon in 2021. U.S. has actually had lower emissions. It's gone from 6 billion tons down to 5 billion tons. So we've made a choice. I'm not going to go on about this. People can talk from the 35,000-foot view of this choice that we've made, but it is the choice and the trade that we've made. So let's talk about North Dakota. These are statistics that the Lignite Energy Council produces. There are 5 coal generation stations in North Dakota. There are 4 lignite surface mines that produce 26.6 million tons of coal in a year. This supports almost 13,000 direct and secondary jobs. Direct and secondary economic activity is $5.6 billion. That compares to North Dakota's GDP of just under $54 billion. So you can trace coal activity is over 10% of North Dakota's GDP. And the coal industry contributes $119 million in state and local taxes to our economy. So let's talk about Basin's coal fleet. The original units that we built in the early Leland Olds Unit 1 in early 1960, and we completed it in 1966, was a 220 megawatt facility, Leland Olds 1. And then in the mid-70s, we completed Leland Olds 2. Leland Olds consumes 3.3 million tons of North Dakota coal every year. So that is just over 12% of North Dakota's coal production, that 26.6 million tons that I mentioned a slide ago. Antelope Valley Station, we've got 2 units there. It's a 900 megawatt facility, and it consumes 5.1 million tons of carbon, or consumed 5.1 million tons of carbon in 2022. So that is just under 20% of the coal that is produced in North Dakota. We've got a small world story about Antelope Valley Station. The people that, the 2 men that were in charge of constructing this facility back in the late 70s and the early 80s were gentlemen by the name of Jim DeBeck and Fred Mistall. And so Antelope Valley, when it was completed in the mid-80s, Basin's realized that its load forecast was way too aggressive. We probably recognized that during the midst of construction. And when Antelope Valley Station was completed, Basin had 2,000 megawatts of generation and only 1,000 megawatts of load. Problem. So Basin wasn't going to build anything for the foreseeable future, probably 15 or 20 years. And in fact, it didn't. And so Fred Mistall and Jim DeBeck were kind of looking at each other going, well, what are we going to build next? It's going to be nothing here. Well, about that time, there was a utility on the East Coast that was going to build its first coal facility. And so Fred Mistall and Jim DeBeck moved to Virginia, and they took jobs with Old Dominion Electric Cooperative, my original utility employer, and they built Clover Coal Station. And so looks a lot like Antelope Valley Station. It came online in 1996. So when I joined Old Dominion in 2000, this plant still had its new car smell to it. So it was a brand new plant and really the pride of our fleet. And at the end of the day, the joke was all on Old Dominion Electric Cooperative because 2 Basin employees that built this put the Basin colors, Basin blue, at the top of this facility in Virginia. So it's a proud moment for Old Dominion, proud moment for me, having worked with those 2 gentlemen to be where they got their start in the utility industry. So the third facility that Basin has that burns North Dakota coal or consumes North Dakota coal is Dakota Gasification Company. And DGC takes lignite coal, converts it into synthetic natural gas, as well as 13 other products that are fertilizer related. And DGC consumes 5.3 million tons of North Dakota coal in 2022. So that's just over 20% of the coal that is produced in North Dakota. So altogether, Basin's 3 facilities that consume North Dakota coal consume over 50% of the coal that is produced in the state. Then I won't go into these, but these are the 2 other coal facilities that we have in our portfolio, Laramie River Station and Dry Fork Station, both in Wyoming. So we've got a large existing coal fleet. Probably not going to be building a new coal facility in the rest of my career. I'm 52 years old, so work to 62 or 65. I don't see that happening. But I think there are encouraging things going on with carbon sequestration that might provide for coal facilities to be built in the future. While we're not going to build a new coal facility, we don't have one on the drawing board, we're going to invest in the existing facilities. This is our capital expenditure program over the next 10 years. Basin will spend $5.1 billion in CapEx. $150 million of those capital expenditures will be on our coal fleet, and then we'll spend another almost $350 million in maintenance projects that aren't capital expenditures. They will be expensed immediately when we spend those dollars. So we'll be investing almost $500 million in our coal facilities over the next decade. Currently, we have 11 major capital expenditure projects going on. They total $1.9 billion. 1.3 billion of those are on this map, but I'm not going to focus on Pioneer, which is a natural gas facility. I'll focus on the transmission projects we're working on, and those foot to about $500 million of capital expenditures over the next 3 years. And there's some people that say, well, when you're building out transmission, all you're doing is allowing wind to be dispatched more. You can move wind electrons around more efficiently. That is not true in this case. If you look at this map, you'll see that one of the transmission lines, the longest one and the costliest one, goes from Leland Old Station up to Tandy. Tandy is in the Williston load pocket that we call it at Basin. You call it the Bakken oil field. We've got to get energy up there. So we are taking coal electrons and getting them up to help the production of natural gas and oil. And then the smaller ones round up to Coomer Ridge and Pioneer to Judson. Similar story there, especially with round up to Coomer Ridge. That is to get electricity from Antelope Valley and Leland Olds into the Williston load pocket or the Bakken oil field. We are taking electricity produced by coal and helping the United States and North Dakota produce natural gas. So let me close on a very high note, carbon capture. This should be the pride of North Dakota. We have proven with our carbon storage efforts in the state going back 30 years that innovation can trump regulation. In 1993, the legislature said you can put CO2 through a pipeline. Basin Electric built a 205-mile pipeline up to Canada for the transportation of CO2 from DGC to Canadian oil fields for enhanced oil recovery. Then, in 2009, the legislature started working on allowing carbons to be sequestered underneath our feet in our geology. Did a number of years of work, and then in 2013, the EPA signed off on this. So what happened? Well, Red Tail, an ethanol plant, began sequestering carbon in 2022. Minn Kota has Project Tundra, so they're going to keep a coal facility open by sequestering carbon with a new carbon sequestration project. And then you've got Basin Electric. Our subsidiary, DGC, should start sequestering carbon, the carbon that goes up to Canada. We'll take some of those flows away, and we will sequester that with our partners, Coteau, and we'll start sequestering that in the first quarter of 2024. So again, innovation in North Dakota is trumping regulation. And I'm optimistic that if we can continue to work on carbon sequestration, that the coal assets that we have in the state have a bright and long future. With that, I will stop. Well, I can go back and I can put one more statistic with DGC. We'll do 2 million tons, hopefully, next year. And then the last picture just shows the wells that we've drilled along with our partners, Coteau and North American Coal, in order to sequester
DGC's CO2 stream.
Thank you very, very much. It's great to be here.